Today is the second day of the February 86 7-day retreat. We will work on a question or maybe several questions that have come up in meetings. Again, let me say that questions are not remembered verbatim. They're reformulated here. What was asked was something like this. I've been doing this work for a couple of years, but I can't see in any way that my life has changed. Same patterns repeat themselves. Same difficulties, the same habits. I have realized that there's nothing inside. That came to me as a realization that there's nothing in here. But if this organism here just lives and dies, what's the use of it all? What's the meaning of it if there's nothing left, if there's nothing to attain? If I can't get this something else that I was hoping for, to find, then what is not just the meaning of this work, but also the meaning of all life? This question of what is the meaning of all life is a very familiar one. It used to haunt me, particularly during the years of war and post-war. During the war, the utter fragility, perishability, and expendability of life. Constant threat of being bombed out or killed by a bomb, or land in a concentration camp. And the hopes for a loving God or Savior to take care, totally shattered by the events that were happening all around one. And mutual suspicions. One couldn't really trust one's best friend. Whether or not one would be denounced for what one said. The powerlessness of oneself in the presence of an all-powerful government. And looking around now, it's just that the scene has somewhat changed, but the conditions haven't. The same thing goes on in different countries, the world over. The total disrespect of life, the violence, the hatred, the suspicion, the corruption, and confusion in human beings the world over. What has changed, even though we've all gone to churches and prayed, celebrated and made offerings? What change has happened in human beings? Since day one. And this person wondering about this. Nothing has changed in myself. What's the use of this work if I can't see change? If what I hoped was attainable is just pointed out to be an idea? Then just living and dying, what's the meaning of that? Do we feel the question ourselves? And does one wonder, or begin to wonder, what may be at the root of all human suffering that has been just listed in some of its details? We just live in the symptoms of it. But what is the root? What is the root disease of all, the root of the human disease? The root of all sorrow that has gone on since one can't remember how long. Certainly as long as written or spoken history has existed. And is it possible to come in touch with that root? See, for that, there has to already be a realization that what happens in oneself as one observes closely, honestly, freely, how one lives from day to day, from moment to moment, alone and in one's relationships with the people one works with, one lives with, one comes in casual contact with. If there's close and intimate and caring observation of how we live ourselves, then one may realize that what is happening throughout the world is what is happening in individual human beings. Feeling of self-alienation, helplessness, insufficiency, fear of loneliness, fear of abandonment, and all that comes out of these feelings, the craving for power or being associated with something or somebody powerful at all costs. In mentioning things, we can never talk about the whole thing. These are always slices from within the pie. It's not only that, as much more, but one can't look at all the things at one time. Or can one, on a different level? We asked at the beginning of the retreat of, why is one here? What did one come here for? And to question that seriously. Not suspiciously, but seriously. Suspicion already means one doesn't want to see certain things. We've been raised to get things for ourselves or for our group, our family, to work for a reward, to work toward a goal or an aim. This has been our conditioning since we've been very, very little. And our parents were conditioned that way, and their parents and our grandparents. Always striving for something. Getting something for ourselves or becoming something. Becoming a better human being. And this striving with all its byproducts. Of disregard of those who will get in our way. This striving all the time at the expense of looking what we actually are, where we're actually coming from. What is our moment-to-moment condition? The truth of it. Not the inherited ideas about it. The inherited or acquired ideas about it, but the actual truth of this moment in the human life or in shared living together. Not just being caught up in the surface ripples of what we say in our repartees and conversations which flow so mechanically. But feeling and looking and listening deeper. What underlies what we say and how we feel? So it's quite understandable that one comes here the way one is conditioned, to get something, to find something, obtain, attain, become somebody. This is, what else do we know when we arrive at a place like this? And we expect, because we know no differently, that this something will be promised us when we get here. And then to find that neither is anything promised, nor is anything supported, any belief or hope supported, but rather, as one person recently mentioned it in a retreat in Germany, said, in every talk or meeting, some more rug or flooring seems to be pulled out from under me. And seem to have any more foundation on which to rest with some sense of security. So even though one comes here with one's conditioned expectations, is one open to the possibility of finding out about our expectations, about our conditioning, about how we actually live, and plumbing that deeply, not superficially, but deeply. So maybe one can come upon the truth of human living, the truth of life, not the promises of life, or the meaning of life, but the truth of it. See, the meaning of life, and thinking back when this question was such a burning, consuming question, it was always expected that what one saw would point somehow beyond itself to a deeper meaning. So one was wishing for that deeper meaning to appear rather than looking at what was there to be looked at, to be understood in its stark factuality. One doesn't need any theoretical background, philosophical, theoretical, religious, theoretical, or psychological, theoretical background to observe what happens when somebody calls us by a bad name, or does us an injustice, says something about us that we haven't done, rejects us or slights us or flatters us. It's open to immediate observation. Observation not just meaning analyze, it doesn't mean analyzing, it means to see, to feel, to listen. No retreat goes by in which we don't ask this question passionately. What is it that gets hurt when we get hurt? One hears the question, but does one ask it when one gets hurt in relationship? Not immediately react to the hurt and inflict counter hurt, or pout, or feel sorry for oneself, but to look what happens. Whether there isn't indeed a self-image, myself as such and such is not being respected, has been hurt, and an image of the other who did the hurting. And that image of oneself and this hurtful situation connects with all past hurts, since maybe before the day we were born. They all smart in unison. And what is a self-image? What is it? What is its function? Why do we have it? What does it do for us? Do we need it? Can we do without it? It gives us a feeling of existence, of being somebody. And we cling to that evidence of being somebody. And the evidence is the self-image. Or the way it is, when it is treated properly, then we feel good. When we're treated with respect, this gives us a sense of well-being, which is energy. If it is disrespected, it gives us a sense of deflation, depression, or anger, which is also energy. Energy to defend or to hit back, or, as one person recently said, I don't feel like hitting back. I feel, well, that's another indication that I'm a loser. That I'm not loved by people. Nobody cares for me, and that's also a self-image to which one is attached. People say, well, wait a minute, the self is not just images, it's much more than that. It's all my feelings, my emotions, and my will. I have a will to change, a will to do good, a will to become better. Isn't that all part of the self too? Yes, it is. Can one detect, notice the interrelationship between thought and emotion? One word, one cross word or cross gesture, the hurt, the feelings, the will to defend oneself, or to hit back, to inflict like with like. Or the feeling drawn to where there is no hurting, where there is support of the self in all its feelings of insecurity and vulnerability, feeling protected someplace, taken care of, which is always a temporary thing. It may flip over at any time when these expectations are suddenly not met. Somebody who one thought was caring all of a sudden turns away from one toward someone else. And one is shattered in one's trust in human beings. And there's sorrow again. Sorrow, self-pity, pain, fear of being lonely. The person said, what we started with was at the beginning, I've seen that there's nothing inside. Does it mean no more hurts? No looking for security? No attachment? What does one mean when one says, I know there's nothing inside? Is it that one has dropped the idea of a soul? The idea of it, but clings to this incredibly deep sitting conviction that there is me as a separate entity. Because it is this me that wants meaning in life, meaning from life, because it feels separate from life. This whole me structure, which is made up of our images, memories of ourselves, what we've gone through, what we've learned. That feels separate from what it calls life. Doesn't it? Also feels separate from what it calls the world. There's me and there's all this hostility out there. The rejection. Other people may be having it in for me, not liking me. And when one takes a walk, so often people say, I can walk through the woods or along the creek, but I'm so caught up in my own problems, fears, or wants that I can't see the tree. I can't see it. Or one may not see another person entering the room who says hello. It happens. Somebody comes into the room and says good morning. And one is so involved with oneself or reading the paper, one doesn't notice someone else. Not intentional. It's just this encapsulation. And with that, this tremendous problem of what is the meaning of life out there? Or why is the world in such a bad state? It is in such a bad state because it is made up of all of these encapsulated individual beings. Seeking their security and support in different alliances and allegiances. In which there cannot possibly be any meetings of the mind, because all the minds are differently programmed, but all are programmed. So, does one even question this entity which feels itself separate? Or does one take it for granted? Everybody has it. It must serve a function. I just recently read a book where somebody said we wouldn't have it if it didn't serve a function. Which means no more questioning. I don't think that psychotherapy of any kind, at least I'm not aware of it. There may be new psychotherapies that I don't know about. But in general, psychotherapy is not concerned with questioning the self. It is concerned with supporting it, adjusting it, remodeling it. Making it feel secure, relieving it of some of the most blatant symptoms. But not questioning the whole thing. That would mean the therapist would have to question himself, herself, completely. See, we come here and we want to get something beyond the drudgery of our daily life, our daily job, our unsatisfactory relationships or non-existent relationships. We come here and we want something different, something entirely free of all of that. That has been the human yearning, also since time immemorial. There is probably no tribe, however primitive as we call it, and anthropology, where there aren't religious ceremonies meant to take one beyond this ordinary time. In some very so-called primitive tribes, to create a time in which there's no time. And yet once the ceremonies are over, the war paint goes back on and one moves to capture slaves. Or not that all primitive tribes were warriors. Some of them were peaceful, but they were overrun, captured, destroyed, made into slaves. So this yearning for something which is completely different from our daily drudgery and problems, headaches, boredom, that's alive in most human beings. And usually it gets channeled into a field of amusement, entertainment, drinking, smoking, drugs, which takes its toll on the organism itself. So it dulls or begins to actually ail. It is dulled. And then there's the need for more of it, because it does organism gets used to anything and needs more in order to feel stimulation. Does one see, though, in wanting this other, one wants to jump right over the mess we've all created for ourselves, leave that behind in one big, huge leap. I don't know whether that's possible. And it's clear that the other is an idea, a fantasy, born out of this mess. Is that clear, or is that an assertion? Well, one can look at it for oneself. If enlightenment is mentioned, or liberation, what is that this moment as it is mentioned, as it is uttered? Is it there? Meaning freedom from the self? Or is it a beautiful, inspiring idea? One may feel the inspirational energy tickling up the spine, maybe. But that's not enlightenment, or freedom, or liberation. That's just a physical response to an enticing idea. We can engage in fantasies about the other, enlightenment, and spend our time that way. Eventually we'll have to come back to work and relate with people, because this is where we are. No amount of fantasy will resolve our daily living, will bring insight into how we talk, relate, act, behave. That can happen from moment to moment if we begin to question it, if we really want to find out the truth of who and what we are, not in an esoterical sense, but actually who and what we are as we talk to each other. On the place of work, or in the family, husband and wife, or the mother with her children, the teacher. And it takes very acute, innocent, subtle attention to hear. We usually don't listen to how we sound. And then if somebody tells us afterwards, you know how you sounded, we don't want to hear it. We're already hurt again. But it's only in such a way that conditioning can be brought to light, and maybe in that process begin to crumble, become porous. Yeah, porous is a good word. It lets light and air through. It's not so dense and immovable, inevitable. We can have fantasies about liberation, but we can study and question and see the present in which we live. That's a fact. That's possible. And such discovery, when it really happens, not theoretically, but actually, if one sees, realizes something, or has insight into something, there can be real joy in that. No matter what it is that is discovered. The very act of discovery brings as a side effect joy. Sometimes even love. Love for everybody else who is in the same boat. These others who one thought were the cause of our misery, now one understands it. It comes from the same source. This is hard work. But it's possible. It's not out of reach. It's not fantasy. And it can bring in its way a dropping of habits that one never thought one even had. One only thought the other people have those funny habits. And that's the beauty of relationship, that one can really discover oneself and how one affects others and how others affect one, if one doesn't get stuck in the hurt and the repartee. But looks quietly, silently, with great care. Sometimes people ask me, what do I do at work? I get so revved up and so upset at times. And there's so much to do, so many people around. No place to sit. But there are quiet places. There's at least one men's room and one women's room. Sounds ludicrous, but I mean it. One can close the door behind one and stand still for a moment. Or sit down and be quiet and just let the whole turmoil, the energy, the revved up energy reveal itself without saying a thing about it. Or maybe if there's a window, most offices don't have windows anymore. We really live very cruelly. Neon lights and no windows. And if the windows are there, somebody told me repeatedly, they are closed tight, they are airtight, energy efficient. One is not allowed to open them. And there's maybe 60 people in a room. And a computer buzzing all the time out of the computer room. It's incredible how we live. So even in a room like that, is it possible to pause? To really pause for a moment? And not do anything but listen? Sometimes people tell me in a meeting, you know, at times in listening or talking here, I feel very close to this thing of that there is something other than this constant activity of self. I can tell this activity of self now. It's very palpable, it's very noticeable, clear. And at times in listening there seems to be an intimation of this state in which the self is not there. But then immediately there's a gush of fear. Or even terror. Look at it immediately when that arises. What brought it about? Don't just say it came on its own. It seems to come on its own because thoughts come and go so quickly, but the physical effect stays on, lingers on. But wasn't there a thought of, what will happen to me when I have no self? What will I be? The self questioning its future and trembling. This fear of disappearing. And the idea of it, again, we again go on fantasy then. Just as enlightenment is a fantasy, so is the idea of no self a fantasy, and it can be drawn out in all kinds of threatening or terrorizing colors. Does one realize that the mind is at work, causing the body to react with fear symptoms? And it's not only that one may be afraid of the idea of no me, but there's also the fear of losing all the pleasures of the self, which are what one has to look at it. Most of the time, one's memories of what was and one's desire to recreate for oneself what felt so good once do look at it when the mind dwells on pleasures, whether they have any reality at all or whether it is purely thought and memory. Or when one actually has a good time. Does the mind immediately make it into something, make it into a memory so it can dwell on it later on when one doesn't feel so happy? At the instant that this happens, the pleasure is over. One can find that out very easily. I remember years in my life of this seeking of happiness and constantly asking myself, am I happy now? And it was nothing there. The moment you ask, then there's self-consciousness. And self-consciousness has nothing to do with happiness. It's enclosure and worry and fear and wanting. And boredom. Also, in pursuing pleasures, can one, for oneself, from looking at it, be very clear how every pleasure pursued is also linked with fear and pain. Not take it from the Buddhist texts or from whatever holy scriptures one may have read, but see it for oneself, whether it is in fact so. That a pleasure once experienced may not come back. There's already the nostalgia for it before it's almost over. Or the greed, to greed for having more of it, which is not pleasure. It is immediately a very narrow track which is disrespectful of one's whole environment. The fear of loss of someone who seems to fulfill all of one's expectation for companionship. Or the actual loss, and then the grief. Again, being faced with one's emptiness in the absence of one who filled it so well. Can this all be looked at, observed, learned about truthfully. So there is a vast intimacy with the activities of the self, the activities and feelings, emotions, the life of the self. I think it's only out of this moment-to-moment intimacy with it that the question of whether there may be another way of living is not any more fantasy. It's an open question. And it is the same kind of open listening in which the self reveals itself. It's not a different kind of listening, not a different kind of openness or awareness. It's the same kind. The activity of the mind, which is this whole self-structure, does slow down in a retreat. Sooner or later, for longer or shorter periods, it's not a matter of time. So then is there at times something that is totally unfamiliar, not known, and how quickly the self comes in and wants to know it. Or is scared of it. We went through that. So can one remain with the listening, no matter what happens, not worry about the outcome? The self worries about outcomes. It is an outcome itself. Can one sit or walk or work with no aim whatsoever, with no purpose? This strong, deep-seated conditioning to get someplace revealed and silent. Is totally different from the way we've lived until this instant. So whatever thoughts come up about it, can one see that these are thoughts and they will have their physical effects, but what of it? And listen. Without moving for or against. It is an unconditioned way of being. Which doesn't know. Yet everything is in it. Caw, caw, caw. Someone shuffling through the room, or gurgling stomach, or a thought that has raised a fear. A space for it all. Without the need to zero in on anything. Someone asked, can there be joy without sorrow? The moment it becomes self-conscious, it's finished. We will end here for today.